It's important for us to know that reconciliation is a journey that we go on together. It's a destination, but it's also a journey that we do as a community. And let's look at the end of this quote here. The window of Acts 15 gives us a living model of this idea. Conflict provides an arena for God to speak. So what we want to do today is we want to look at our passage very closely and ask the question, how do the early believers teach us to work through conflict in a way that God speaks to us? How do we learn to do conflict well as a church and create space for it to be a holy moment, a moment where God does something in us, helps us understand ourselves more and one another more? So we're going to try to look at our passage today and get those clues for how they did it and how we can do it today. I'd like to reflect with you briefly here on this image. What do you see here in this picture? What do you see here? Two paths in the woods. Yep. And what is something to observe about these paths? What is something we can observe? They're diverging, right? They're going different directions. And that's right. That's right, Janine. Janine pointed out the bench. But what I'd like us to think about, that's good, thank you. Sometimes when we're in our nature walk, we come to these places where we have to make a choice. Do we take the path on the right or we take the path on the left? Now, sometimes there's a little sign that says the mileage or what the implications of that choice are. Sometimes it's not so clear, particularly if a trail is not well marked. The early church was here in our passage today with a very important question. Do Gentiles need to be circumcised and observe the Jewish customs in the law in order to be saved? One party was saying, yes, they do, and we need to go this direction. And one party was saying, no, they don't. The grace of Christ is sufficient, and we need to go in this direction. And the church in our passage today is sitting here discerning together which direction they are to go. And God is working, and we can see that in our passage. Now, the church would look very different today if they had discerned a different path, if they had discerned that the law was, in fact, mandatory for Gentiles. But they didn't, and so we are where we are today with the freedoms that we have as Gentile believers. And so we need to spend some time looking at this passage. I actually want to invite you to take out the Pew Bible or your own, if you have your own, and turn to page 1072. That's 1072. Acts chapter 15. And I want to just ask, just initially here, as we look at the first 5 verses, verses 1 through 5, if you just kind of look at that on your own. And I just want to ask you, what are the early believers doing here? If we want to know how to do conflict well, let's see how they start. When things kind of heat up, what do they initially do? Look at verses 1 through 5, just on your own. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but there are these two groups in this passage we look at so far. Paul and Barnabas representing the group that wants to include the Gentiles without the restrictions of the law, the regulations of the law. And then another group that would identify themselves as part of the Pharisees or Jewish Christians that did want Gentiles to follow the stipulations of the law. And what happens in verses 1 through 5? They come to Jerusalem and they share with the leaders about the problem. They share, it's voiced what the discussion is all about. That information is passed on, it's talked about. And so the first thing we need to do in our context today as a church is when there's something emerging, we need to clarify it. We need to acknowledge what it is. We need to very clearly speak about it and name it. And that's what they were doing in verses 1 through 5. As they're moving towards Jerusalem, and finally when they arrive, they're able to clarify this is really what's at stake, these two positions. Now, what they do in verse 6 is very important, and that's something that we also need to learn from. Verse 6, it says, "The apostles and the elders met to consider this question, the one that they just clarified. Do the Gentiles need to observe the law to be saved? So they decide they're going to consider this question, and what do? Essentially what they do as they approach this is they create this forum, this conversation, this place for discernment. It's almost like a process or a forum, a space where they can share together as believers and reflect and hear different testimonies and perspectives. So they create this safe place, this forum for this discussion. And we today, once we discern there's a problem, we as a congregation need to set apart time and space to talk about it. And I just throw this picture up here because we have done this before at different times. And in the past, this was an attempt to create a forum when we were talking about the Reasoning Together book. And how we did that, how we created that forum, is we put up our commitments to listen to one another. I don't know if you remember, those of you who participated, on the board we had our commitments of how we're going to listen to one another and treat one another and respect one another in that discussion. And that created a safe place for us to discuss ideas and to share our perspectives and our testimonies and our faith. It's very important to letting God speak in conflict and letting it be a life-giving thing. What next? They share their viewpoints. If you look verses 7 through 18, you have one viewpoint shared after another. The reasons why we are to believe what we do about this. And they lay out their experiences and how God spoke to them and what the scriptures say. And that is part of who we are as a community. I have pictures up here of some of our members. You know, each of us has that unique viewpoint that God's given us, that unique experience. And it's so important when conflict arises that we come to the whole congregation in that safe place, in that forum, and we share what God is speaking to us. That's healthy. That's important for us each to have that space to be able to share how God is speaking to us and leading us. And they listen. They don't just share. They don't just actively do what they want to do, but they actually slow down and they listen to what the others are saying. Verses 12 through 13, the word listen appears several times. You see in verse 12, it's especially pronounced if you look there. The whole assembly became silent as they listened. So can you just think, times when we would pause and reflect and listen as God speaks to us as a group, as a community. They listen. And then once again, James speaks, and he calls them to listen to him. To listen. Let's practice this spiritual discipline of listening. That's very important in working through conflict together. It's very important. And it's something that we always need to seek to grow in. How can we listen better? Listen to God and listen to others. Now, I want to put up a chart here. This may seem very technical, but I think it's something that happens in church discussions, and we need to be aware of it. And there's something we can learn from it here. This is based off of a book by Ralph Kilman called Advanced Training in Conflict. And he says often in communities or groups, when they're talking about something or working through a hard question or a hard issue, that there's in one sense the desire to be assertive. Some people in the community want to get their own way, and that's that kind of expression of assertiveness. And sometimes that can lead to a type of competition between people or groups in a larger community. But then there's also an equally powerful impetus or feeling that some people have for cooperativeness, to not only get what one wants to happen personally, but to be sensitive to what others want and to be sensitive to their needs. And oftentimes, in its extreme form, it can lead to a type of accommodating, wanting to cooperate so much that a person can accommodate others. And so what Ralph Kilman says is, in communities, often when these things are low, when there isn't a lot of assertiveness and there isn't a lot of cooperativeness going on, that communities can tend to avoid discussions and avoid conflicts over issues. And actually that can be good in some cases if it's something very small that doesn't need to be processed by the whole community. Like, for example, the color of the wallpaper. If you were going to wallpaper a certain room, you wouldn't want to have a congregational meeting every time something like that came up and spend months processing that type of question. It's okay that there's a small level of investment in that. But when you talk about bigger issues like we have in our passage today about including a whole group of people in your ministry model or your way of outreaching and how you think of the gospel, that becomes a much higher stakes discussion. And what Ralph Kilman says is when we have those higher stakes conversation, we may be tempted to compromise, to find some way that the two parties can give and take and find ways to meet each other's interests. But he says what is even more meaningful than that is when it moves beyond that sense of compromise to collaborating, where the different parties in the church learn to work together creatively, and God stirs them, inspires them, and gives them a vision, and they collaborate together, and out of that flows a new understanding or a new approach to ministry. So why do I put this up here? It's healthy for us to realize that sometimes we need to take longer to process things as a church so that we can get to higher levels of discussion, even to the point of collaborating together. So sometimes we're going to face questions that it's going to take us a long time to work through, but we do want to get to a place where we come to a conclusion and we collaborate. Some things as a church we just have to name and say those are not, they're small scale things that we're not going to process, like the color of the wallpaper or certain things like that. So this is a model, a way to say we don't just want to be high in our assertiveness and be competitive. We don't just want to be low in our cooperation and be accommodating. We want to find ways that we can collaborate in the highest way when it comes to big picture discussions, which is what happened in the early church. And everybody got behind this. Everybody got behind this. So the next thing that is in our passage, and I think this is fascinating and very important, is that if you see what was going on in the conversation, that each person who spoke had something unique to bring, their own kind of giftedness that God had given them. And there's a passage that Paul gives us elsewhere that helps us understand this. Ephesians chapter 4. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and the teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Now, I want to bring this passage into our conversation because Paul points out Jesus had intended that his community, his church, would have different members in it, people that have these unique giftings. And when they're invited into the conversation and they're given a place, that the result is he uses that to bring maturity to the body, to attain a greater depth, a greater fullness. And what I think sometimes happens in congregational discussions is we don't recognize that when this person over here speaks or that person over there speaks, if they're challenging us or have a different perspective, we don't always realize that sometimes it flows out of their gifting. So I want to take a little time today to talk about these giftings and to say it's healthy to have these present in our congregational discussions when we're working through conflict or different points of view. It's healthy to have these present. And in fact, if we can listen to these different voices in a healthy way, God will really bring fullness and blessing to our community. So I just want to talk about first the apostle. Now we tend to think, when I say apostle, we probably think of the 12 apostles, right? And we tend to think of an office or some title that somebody has. But apostleship, if we look at the meaning of the term, it's related to the Greek word to send. It means those who are sent. In the Greek secular literature, it was often those who were sent by a king or somebody of authority with a message, and they carry that message. They're apostello, they're sent by the king, and they're the ones who are the bearers of this message. And so, in a very real way, every believer has this sent quality. That's what mission means. We've said mission means to be sent. But there's some people in the church that have this unique stirring, and I want to read a little bit about this from Alan Hirsch's website. He was the speaker at the mission conference I was at a few weeks ago. He says, apostles extend the gospel as the sent ones. They ensure that faith is transmitted from one context to another, from one generation to the next, and they're always thinking about the future, bridging barriers, establishing the church in new context, developing leaders. Who in our passage is thinking like that? Who in our passage today is thinking like that? New areas of ministry, new context, building bridges. Paul, all right? We can hear Paul's voice. The Gentiles haven't been reached before in this way, and they are open and they're hungry, And he has this apostolic stirring to reach this group of people who haven't been reached yet. And then we have the prophet. The prophet here represented, so the apostle is the one carrying this flag. The prophet here represented by the waves and the wind. They're the person when there's that scripture about when the wind and the waves of different beliefs and doctrines come, we don't want to be tossed about. And the prophet's the one that kind of tries to keep us anchored. So the prophet knows God's will. They are particularly attuned to God and his truth for today. They bring correction and challenge the dominant assumptions we inherit from our culture. They insist that the community obey what God has commanded, and they question the status quo. So we need prophets in our conversation to challenge us, to remind us of what is wrong in our culture and how it affects us as a church, to call us back to God's justice for our world, and call us back to the path God calls us in. And so they have an important role in this conversation, and you can hear voices of prophets speaking out. Well, what is God's truth here in this passage? And how do we understand how the law has been preached? And they're calling back to make sense of this conversation. Third, we have the evangelists. These are the infectious communicators of the gospel who recruit others. And they call for a personal response to God's redemption. They draw believers to engage in wider mission. So we need our evangelists in our midst to keep calling us to look outward, outside the walls of the church, and to kind of refocus our attention on the basic message of what we believe and what we proclaim. Now, I wanted to spend a long time with these first three because very rarely in the church do we talk about them. We know that there's a category for those giftings. We all would affirm that in Scripture, but we're not always using these terms for one another. We're often thinking of maybe individuals from the Bible or more general concepts, but do you know in this room we have people with these gifts? Sitting in this room, that Christ had initiated it and meant it for each local church to have all 5 of these giftings. And when we have our congregational meetings, I think we have to have greater sensitivity to that. I think we're all on board with shepherds and teachers, those that maintain relationship in the community and want to have spiritual health in the community, and those that want to teach God's message and have a depth of understanding of what that means. We all are used to these giftings, and in a lot of ways, church focuses on those. But is there maybe another piece of this picture we need to go deeper with? Do we need to have more time recognizing the other giftings in our community? I think we do. And so the next time we have a congregational meeting, we're talking about issues, let's be attentive to the prophetic voice that's challenging our assumptions. Let's be attentive to the apostolic voice. It's how can we build bridges and think about the future? Let's be attentive to the evangelistic voice. How does this relate back to the calling of the gospel? And let's find ways to affirm this in one another. I would like down the road for us as a congregation to spend more time looking inward and asking the question, which of these 5 gifts do I feel really is stirring in my life? And how can I share that more in our congregation? So finally, after these voices have spoken, Peter, James, Paul, various voices representing different groups, they decide that the Gentiles do not need to follow the law of Moses and all of its regulations and stipulations to be saved, but that they should be sensitive to certain things out of respect to their Jewish brothers and sisters. And they decide that they're going to write a letter, and they implement this decision by sending individuals to carry this letter. Now, what they've done, essentially, is they've taken this issue and the conflict, and they found a way to place it in the wider mission that they're engaged in as a church. And I think that is the big challenge when we have an issue that arises that's hard for us. We need to find ways to put that in perspective. How does that particular thing fit into where we're going? How does that relate to what we feel our big picture calling is as a congregation? How does that relate to what we do next? And then once we can answer those questions, we need to implement what we've decided. We don't want to be stuck in a wash cycle, constantly spinning and never getting that point of implementing. We need to work hard at discernment so that we can finally come at the end to a place where we say, this is where we go next. So I think this is a helpful thing to keep in mind for any issue or conflict, that it isn't the whole of who we are. It isn't the whole of where we're going, but when we work through it well, it can find a place to be a part of where we're going next. So I want to leave you with these two things. First, what practices do we need to embrace for conflict to provide an arena for God to speak? So what do we need to do well as a church to maximize these opportunities so that they really benefit us? And I'm going to actually ask you that question. What do we need to do? Just if you think of something, I've just shared a few ideas. What jumped out to you from what I just shared? What would be a really helpful practice? Listen. Thank you. Yes. That kind of holy practice, that discipline of listening is so important to this process. What else? What other practices? What? Time for discussion. Excellent. Creating that safe space for that sharing of ideas. Anything else? Communication with people. That's good, Janine. That has to be healthy. And we need to really encourage that. Jeremy? Practicing humility, yes. Paul's call to worship really highlighted that. The call to humility. This must have been a very humbling conversation, too, in Acts 15. Yes? Did somebody else say something? Prayer. Oh, prayer. Yes, thank you, Kathy. Prayer is an important and essential part of discernment. Yeah. And I hope that we will acknowledge the giftings that God has given to others, to make space for the different gifts in our community to really be a part of shaping our calling and our vision together. And finally, I want to leave you once again with a reminder, be an advocate. Be an advocate for healthy relationships and communication in our church. So practice listening, give space for others to share, go directly in communication if there's conflict, go directly to a person if you're involved with it. If you're not, and somebody comes to you and they want to send something through you to someone else, be an advocate and say, I encourage you to go directly to that person in the teachings of our Lord. Try to be, as much as possible, focus on the model we talked about last week, Matthew 18. And as we do that, and as we create the space to discuss and work through conflict well, our culture as a church is going to be empowered, and it's going to be inspiring in new ways how God will use the things that are hard to actually give us momentum and help us to grow in ministry and in our love and service of Him. Will you please